Welcome. Thank you for choosing to watch this video and add value to your sleep time. Fall asleep listening to inspiring life stories of legends and learn from their life subconsciously. Please subscribe for our channel and sleep inspired daily. In the shadowed corridors of Alexandria's royal palace, where marble gleamed beneath flickering oil lamps and the air was thick with the scent of lotus and papyrus, a legend was born. Cleaving away centuries of myth and misinterpretation, one finds the story of Cleopatra VII, a woman fiercely intelligent, politically brilliant, and imbued with the spirit of a world both ancient and dazzlingly cosmopolitan. Cleopatra's life did not begin in assurance or privilege, but in the precarious uncertainty that defined the Ptolemaic dynasty, a kingdom ever at the mercy of Roman ambition and internal strife. Cleopatra VII Cleopatra, born in 69 BC, emerged to a dynasty already fatigued by intrigue and revenge. Unlike the pharaohs of old, her family, descended from Ptolemy I Soter, Alexander the Great's companion, was Macedonian Greek, ruling in Egypt that had not seen a native dynasty in nearly 3 centuries. Yet what set Cleopatra apart from her predecessors was her burning desire to bridge the cultures over which she ruled. In a tradition where Greek rulers scarcely spoke the language of their Egyptian subjects, Cleopatra not only mastered Egyptian, but also spoke at least 9 tongues, including Hebrew, Aramaic, Parthian, and Latin. She steeped herself in the traditions of the pharaohs, presenting herself as the living embodiment of Isis, the great mother goddess, and thus wove herself into the spiritual fabric of the land. From the beginning, her life was fraught with peril. The palace in Alexandria, that shimmering jewel clinging to the Mediterranean, harbored fires wrought from sibling rivalry, Roman interference, and internal betrayal. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, was a weak monarch beset by debt and Roman leverage. His reign was punctuated by exile and bloody returns, orchestrated less by native will and more by the whims of Rome's power brokers. The young Cleopatra experienced firsthand the uncertainty of palace intrigue. Her father bartered with the Romans. Her sisters, like Bernice IV, vied bloodily for power, and the people of Egypt grew restless, resentful of foreign rule and the humiliations of tribute. Through all this, Cleopatra grew not as a pampered princess, but as an intellectual and survivor. She absorbed the teachings of the Library of Alexandria, surrounded by scrolls and philosophers from Greece, Persia, India, and Africa. She delved into mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and, contrary to the lies of her detractors, even the darker arts of political manipulation, poisons, and rites. Her ability to think strategically was forged in the crucible of constant danger, and it was here, before she ever wore the double crown, that Cleopatra began shaping her destiny. In 51 BC, the death of her father catapulted Cleopatra into power, but not into safety. At just 18, she was forced to share the throne with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII, according to the unyielding conventions of her ancestors. Yet, as the air in the palace thickened with whispers and plots, conflict soon erupted. Advisors loyal to Ptolemy XIII sidelined Cleopatra, first in ceremony, then in reality. Her face disappeared from coins, her name from decrees. Eventually, she was forced into exile in Syria, stripped of her armies and allies, left only with her intellect and a burning desire to reclaim her homeland. Exile could have meant oblivion, but Cleopatra transformed it into opportunity. She began marshaling support among dissidents, mercenaries, and foreign allies. Even in the wilderness, her persuasiveness and diplomatic skills shone. She negotiated with local lords, sent secret messages to contacts in Alexandria, and never ceased plotting her return. In this dark hour, a tidal force swept toward Egypt. The Roman civil war, with Julius Caesar in pursuit of his fallen adversary, Pompey, Cleopatra's younger brother, urged by self-doubt and advisors like the sinister eunuch Pothinos, had Pompey murdered as a misguided bid to gain Caesar's favor. Instead, it appalled the Roman general and gave Cleopatra a singular opportunity to entwine her fortune with the fate of Rome itself. In a moment that has slipped into legend, Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, concealed, according to tradition, in a carpet or a linen sack, smuggled past guards to present herself, radiant and composed, before Caesar. Here was no seductress leaning solely on beauty, but a woman whose wit, intelligence, and presence immediately captivated one of history's shrewdest power brokers. Cleopatra pleaded her case, not as a damsel in distress, but as a pharaoh, ambitious, resourceful, and determined to rule. This meeting marked the turning point. Caesar, enthralled not just by Cleopatra's charisma, but by her strategic acumen, allied himself with her in the ensuing Alexandrian War. Through heated street battles, sieges, and palace intrigues, Cleopatra displayed formidable leadership, negotiating alliances, rallying Egyptian forces, and surviving attempts on her life. Though Caesar's legions eventually triumphed, much of the success owed not only to Roman might, but to Cleopatra's ability to inspire and command. With Ptolemy XIII defeated and drowned in the Nile, Cleopatra emerged not merely as Rome's client queen, but as the sovereign ruler of Egypt. She named her younger brother Ptolemy XIV as nominal co-ruler, by custom and for appearance's sake, but in every meaningful sense, Egypt belonged to Cleopatra. She would soon bear Caesar a son, Ptolemy V Caesarion, a move both personal and deeply political, meant to secure both their dynasty and Egypt's independence. Yet her position was anything but secure. Egypt was battered by famine, indebted to Rome for millions in tribute, and vulnerable to corruption and brigandage. Its rural people struggling under the pressure of taxes and foreign soldiers left over from past Roman interventions. Cleopatra faced these challenges head-on. She undertook sweeping economic reforms, revitalized trade networks, and attacked corruption in the bureaucracy. Her policies raised Egypt's tax revenues and helped stabilize the currency. She championed learning and the arts, sponsoring scholars and linking her reign to the glory of the earlier pharaohs, something her Greek uncles had rarely done. Cleopatra's reign saw great building works, including temples and monuments, which fused Greek and Egyptian traditions. But perhaps her most remarkable achievement lay in her ability to balance the demands of Rome while fiercely defending Egypt's autonomy. Many see her as a pawn of powerful men, but the reality is she played the great game of Mediterranean politics with a mastery few could rival. She used Caesar's protection to her advantage, journeying to Rome at his invitation, dazzling the city with her splendor and intelligence, and working to secure her son's status and her country's safety. She navigated the treacherous world of Roman politics, forming alliances, yet always watching for betrayal. Behind the dazzling public image lay a mind unafraid of experimentation and change. She surrounded herself with thinkers and scientists, delved into alchemy, experimented on poisons. A detail seized on by her enemies, but one that reveals her as a woman pushing boundaries, not just in politics, but in science and medicine too. For her people, Cleopatra represented far more than a queen. She was an embodiment of both Greek sophistication and Egyptian tradition, a ruler who prayed in the ancient temples, led religious festivals, and connected the sun-kissed Nile Valley to the vast ambitions of the wider world. Her charisma and intelligence won her deep loyalty among Egyptians, who thrived under the prosperity she helped restore, and whose priests and artisans she patronized. Beyond Egypt, her legend began to grow, carried on the lips of traders and diplomats, admired and reviled in lands as distant as Parthia and Nubia. Let this be the first message echoed from Cleopatra's life. Greatness is not a gift bestowed by birthright or beauty, but forged in relentless adversity, imagination, and the willingness to be more than tradition expects. Cleopatra was not the siren of Roman myth, but a sovereign who dared to blend cultures, challenge empires, and shape her age. The passage of time in Cleopatra's Alexandria brought no peace, only fresh currents of intrigue and opportunity. Rome's wobbling balance of power after Caesar's death in 44 BC left every ruler in the Mediterranean world unsettled. Cleopatra was not immune. After Caesar's assassination, she found herself plunged into uncertainty once again. Alexandria, once secure in Caesar's friendship, now buzzed with the uneasy gossip of the city's many Greco-Egyptian factions, Roman merchants, spies nestled in street markets, and priests whispering prayers in the gloom of ancient temples. Amid these shadows, the fate of her dynasty and the independence of Egypt hung by a fraying thread. What history often neglects is how solitary Cleopatra's role could be. Only a few trusted attendants and scholars truly knew the weight on her shoulders. When she returned from Rome, after presenting herself beside her young son Caesarion as living testimony to her alliance with Caesar, her enemies whispered that she had overstayed, that in the confusion of the Ides of March, she had both mourned and calculated new alliances. It was not the comfort of a guest she experienced in Rome, but the ever-present edge of exile, suspicious senators, scandalized Roman matrons, and rivals like Octavian and Mark Antony weighing her very existence as a piece on their chessboard. Cleopatra understood with chilling clarity that Egypt was cast in the spotlight of Roman appetites. The kingdom's wealth, grain, papyrus, glass, gold, and the sacred Nile's bounty had long attracted not just traders but empires. The queen now bore the burden of shielding her land, even as Rome's power shifts grew bloodier. Following Caesar's death, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, casting a long shadow over the eastern Mediterranean. Yet Cleopatra saw opportunity in every danger. Mark Antony, bold, extravagant, and ambitious, sought Egypt's support as he set out to avenge Caesar and cement his own power in Rome. Cleopatra, far more than a passive prize, saw in Antony not just a romantic partner, but a political counterweight to Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and her new rival. Their meeting in Tarsus, staged with orchestrated magnificence, stunned the Roman world. Cleopatra sailed up the Cydnus River on a golden barge adorned as Aphrodite herself, incense billowing, musicians in attendance. This was not mere pageantry. It was calculated power, a reminder to all that Egypt and its queen were equals, not vassals. The goddess queen and the Roman commander became lovers, but more crucially, co-conspirators in a bid for dominance of the eastern Mediterranean. Antony found in Cleopatra not only passionate companionship, but also shrewd advice, resources, and even military support. She funded his campaigns, resupplied his troops, and leveraged Egypt's wealth to bind his interests to her own. Behind closed doors, they debated policy, shared intelligence from spies, ranging as far as Parthia and Ethiopia, and charted their vision for a new world order, one in which Egypt might rise above mere survival to become Rome's peer. Cleopatra's alliance with Antony gave her children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, each meant to symbolize a new dynasty, a blending of Roman and Egyptian power. Her vision extended far beyond fleeting romance. She wanted a world wherein her children would rule not as dependent monarchs, but as sovereigns over realms stretching from Cyrenaica to Armenia. She reorganized Egyptian administration, oversaw public works, and revived old rituals and festivals, weaving the spectacle of divine rule into every detail of public life. At this high point of her power, the queen faced growing hostility, both from within and without. Sections of the Alexandrian elite resented her open embrace of local tradition. Some Greek courtiers fumed at Egyptians gaining court favor, and traditionalists suspected her building projects were bleeding the treasury. Meanwhile, famine returned, fueled by years of Nile irregularity, but Cleopatra moved quickly to ration grain, open reserves, and redirect trade to maintain order. Her concern for the welfare of her people so often dismissed in Roman accounts, was real. She addressed the priests, walked among the people during festivals, and gave alms to the poorest. She was not a distant autocrat. Many Egyptians remembered her as a pharaoh of the people, a queen who, in the midst of chaos, did not vanish into gilded halls, but moved in the world as a defender of tradition and provider of hope. Rome, however, was not blind to Antony and Cleopatra's ambitions. Octavian's agents spread rumors. Cleopatra had bewitched Antony, ensnared him in Eastern decadence, threatened Roman virtue. Charges of sorcery and betrayal swelled in the Roman Senate and on the streets. While much has been said about Cleopatra's supposed use of magic to seduce men, few understand this as a metaphor for political power. She had learned to wield intelligence, learning, and pageantry as her weapons, not merely in seduction, but in the shaping of hearts and public opinion, both at home and in Rome. Unheeded by male historians, Cleopatra was also an innovator in science and medicine. She drew upon the wisdom of Alexandria's physicians, sponsoring experiments with cosmetics and cures. Her own medical treatises, now lost, were noted by later Greek writers. She patronized mathematicians, supported advances in astronomy. Her reign saw a resurgence of scholarship, and her court became a beacon attracting scholars driven from Rome and Greece by civil discord. Yet the storm gathered. The alliance with Antony carried seeds of both promise and impending doom. The future of Egypt, and perhaps of the Eastern Mediterranean, now depended on a handful of moments and the perilous gamble of war. Let this be the second message woven through Cleopatra's life: to thrive, even for a season, in a world made hostile by prejudice and power. One must combine courage with imagination, adapting tradition while facing each crisis with relentless ingenuity and heart. Across Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean, the clouds of war grew thick and foreboding. Cleopatra's alliance with Antony, born of desire and ambition both, cast her directly into the whirlwind of Rome's bitter civil conflict. As Octavian amassed his forces and sharpened the edge of propaganda from his seat in the West, Cleopatra did not retreat into passivity or mere intrigue. Instead, she made herself a general and a symbol. Her people no longer saw her only as a queen behind marble walls, but now also as the defender of their realm, standing in temples and on battlefields, weaving ancient rites with modern strategy. Antony and Cleopatra's ambitions became increasingly audacious. Together they crafted a vision of a restored Hellenistic East, with Alexandria as its glittering capital. The donations of Alexandria, a grand ceremony in 34 BC, declared their children heirs to kingdoms, Caesarion to Egypt and Cyprus, Alexander Helios to Armenia and Media, Cleopatra Selene to Cyrenaica and Libya, Ptolemy Philadelphus to Phoenicia and Syria. Antony pledged lands not even yet conquered. In the gleaming audience hall, while gold and incense swirled, Cleopatra was hailed as Queen of Kings, clad not only in Greek stateliness, but also in Egyptian regalia. On her brow, the twin crowns that symbolized Upper and Lower Egypt's eternal unity. But such grandeur was not lost on Rome. Octavian seized the spectacle, denouncing Antony for betraying Roman interests and for being enslaved by an Eastern temptress. Roman society, always uneasy about foreign queens, responded with a mixture of fascination and horror. Octavian's war was as much about perception as legions. He published Antony's will. Some say it was forged, or at least never intended for Rome's eyes, fueling the rumor that Antony intended to move the seat of power to Alexandria. Cleopatra became the enemy incarnate, a living sedition, gilded in gold and poison. The preparations for war were relentless. Cleopatra poured Egypt's wealth into new fleets, drilling crews beside the Nile's mouth, forging ships in shipyards that rang with hammers and Greek voices fused with Egyptian chants. She worked alongside Antony's veterans, overseeing the supply of grain, horses, bronze, and timber, often consulting engineers and mercenaries from far-off lands. Cleopatra herself toured the arsenals, ensuring discipline, coaxing craftsmen, and cutting through wrangling governors whose loyalties wavered under the mounting threat. Within the court, Cleopatra's unyielding spirit was both admired and feared. She rooted out corruption with the help of trusted advisors. Her spies, both native and Greek, reported on Octavian's maneuvers and the grumblings of the folk. There were secret assemblies by the harbor, debates in the Great Hall, where mathematicians projected star movements, seeking divine confirmation of the outcome. She led prayers to Isis and Serapis, performed sacrifices alongside high priests, and even wrote letters to distant monarchs for aid, yet most shrank from antagonizing Rome at this ultimate brink. What is rarely recounted in Roman histories, eager to reduce Cleopatra to a silhouette of desire, is that she personally commanded segments of the navy and shaped the production of new weaponry. Her involvement with the scholars and artisans of Alexandria extended not just to aesthetics and cosmetics, but to unseen advances, improvements to navigation, rudimentary chemical tests for medical and alchemical use, and the preservation and transmission of knowledge through the library. In crisis, Cleopatra proved a tireless administrator, and for those willing to see beyond myth, a proto-scientist and reformer. As the year 31 BC dawned, the decisive battle approached. Cleopatra and Antony encamped with their combined forces at Actium, a promontory in western Greece, facing Octavian's fleet commanded by Marcus Agrippa. The standoff was grueling. Months of attritional maneuvers, supply disruptions, defections, and fever gnawed away at morale. Cleopatra, always mindful of logistics, did what she could to maintain supplies, but the tightening Roman noose proved almost impossible to slip. Finally, on a wind-scoured morning in September, Cleopatra's fleet set sail with Antony's, their banners uniting Egyptian gold with Roman crimson. The infamous Battle of Actium was chaos, rows of galleys colliding, smoke boiling up from fire arrows, shouts and shrieks echoing across the waves. Cleopatra's personal squadron, commanded from her flagship, tried to force a breakout southward. Debate still rages whether her withdrawal was premeditated or instinctive, but her squadron, faster and less heavily laden, escaped through the fray, with Antony abandoning the main fight to follow her. Actium's outcome changed everything. Though she provided the means for their flight back to Alexandria, the defeat sapped Antony's forces and their joint dream of an Eastern dynasty. Cleopatra faced ruin, a ruin not only for herself, but for Egypt, for her children, and for every legacy she had spent a lifetime forging. Yet even in this darkest time, Cleopatra's resolve did not fail. On their return to Alexandria, she immediately set about managing defenses, repairing the city's walls, stockpiling food and water, and sending envoys with offers of tribute and negotiation. She met with foreign mercenaries, offered bribes to wavering Roman commanders, and in a final twist of hope, sent Caesarion eastward under loyal escort, endeavoring to safeguard the dynasty's future. Within the palace, she shored up loyalty with pageantry and ritual. In a series of public ceremonies, she honored Isis and the old gods, reminded the people that Egypt endured in the face of every invader, every tyrant, that her fate and theirs would forever be entwined. Cleopatra even presented herself as a living divinity, a tactic meant to rally the city to face the Romans as one. It was not delusion, but calculated morale building, one last, brilliant attempt to gird Alexandria in unity. When Octavian's forces approached, Alexandria stood anxious but not broken. Cleopatra received the conquering general with composure. She met Octavian as a sovereign, lavished him with treasure, and tried every art of persuasion. Her final political negotiations were a masterclass in rhetoric and subtlety, but Octavian, cold and unmoved, played a long game, intent on presenting her capture as a Roman triumph. Betrayal tore through what remained. Antony, suffering despair and humiliation, took his own life. Cleopatra, now truly alone, resolved on her own course. Silent, composed, surrounded by faithful servants and her children, she made the choice that would echo across centuries: death before dishonor, resistance to the very last. Ancient sources embalm the manner of her passing in layers of fable: a venomous asp hidden in figs, a swift-acting poison, perhaps both, perhaps neither. What matters is not just how she died, but why. Cleopatra's final act was not a surrender, but a testament. She would not march in Octavian's triumph. No goddess shamed before foreign mobs. In the privacy of her tomb, amid old gold and sacred charms, she shaped her own legend one last, defiant time. Let this, then, be the third message from Cleopatra's life. Fate is not merely accepted, but shaped, with courage, with vision, even with sacrifice. The world seldom moves gently for those who challenge the tides, but it remembers them, loud, clear, and forever. The sun rose on Alexandria as the city mourned. Octavian's legions, foreign and implacable, marched through the colonnaded streets in gleaming armor. The city's famed library lay silent, scholars standing at windows, uncertain whether to hide their scrolls or their faces. Alexandria was a city accustomed to rulers. It had felt the feet of conquerors before, but never had it experienced the chill of both defeat and orphanhood, the sudden rupture of its long connection to an Egyptian crown. Word of Cleopatra's death spread through the city like a cold tide. Many refused to believe it. The queen who had stood proudly at festivals, who had ridden in chariots by the harbor, who had spoken to priests and artisans alike, could not have simply vanished. What few chronicles record is the grief that struck not only nobles, but common people. In the suburb of Rakotis, by the old Egyptian quarter, women covered their faces in black and offered prayers to Isis and Osiris. In the Jewish quarter, elders debated whether her end was tragedy or warning, while in the Greek Agora, merchants exchanged tales that mixed admiration, resentment, and unease. Cleopatra's court, the architects, the mathematicians, the priests, the scribes, found themselves both bereaved and afraid. Many scrambled to hide their affiliations, earn correspondence, or bribe the new regime to avoid the wave of reprisals soon to come. Inside the ruined palace, the bodies of Antony and Cleopatra were prepared with all the rites allowed by hurried hands and suspicious Roman officials. Cleopatra's children, suddenly orphaned and divested of every privilege, became pawns in Octavian's triumph. Caesarion, sent east by his mother's last desperate gambit, was lured back with promises of safety, but was instead executed. Too many Caesars are not good for Rome, Octavian reportedly declared. The younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, Ptolemy Philadelphus, were marched off to Rome, their destiny uncertain, their birthright erased. For Egypt, the fall of the last pharaoh was not just political, it was spiritual. For centuries, the pharaoh had been god and sovereign, the axis between the Nile's abundance and the prosperity of the fields. Cleopatra, more than any of her Greek ancestors since Alexander, had given the temples reasons to believe in their relevance. She had restored lands, funded festivals, and honored gods neglected for generations. Her death was thus not only the eclipse of a dynasty, but of Egypt's old world, where the pharaoh's rituals were thought to ensure the balance and order between heaven and earth. Octavian, the conqueror, entered the city with the calculated restraint of empire. He offered amnesties, celebrated with games and parades for the Alexandrians, and reconstituted Egypt as his personal possession, a province ruled not by the Senate, but by imperial appointees, its riches siphoned to feed the vaults of Rome. Between the Temple of Serapis and the once bustling Agora, Roman standards supplanted the banners of Isis and Horus. The bureaucracy changed languages and masters. The priests still prayed, but under the anxious gaze of new magistrates and tax agents. Many of Egypt's treasures marched westward, artworks, scrolls, even sacred animals, in a harvest of conquest. In Rome, Cleopatra's memory received a different fate. Octavian, soon to become Augustus, orchestrated a triumph. He paraded her children in chains, with effigies of Cleopatra, sometimes a wax statue clutching asps, sometimes stylized images as an Eastern goddess, through Roman streets. The crowds, conditioned by years of propaganda, jeered at the sorceress queen, the fiend of the Nile. Augustus cemented his rule not just with power, but by rewriting Cleopatra into a cautionary tale. The foreign temptress, the enemy of virtue, the last obstacle to Roman order. The myth grew, detached from the woman, her intellect, her reforms, her culture, her losses. Yet even in defeat, Cleopatra subverted easy erasure. Reports from Alexandria and regions beyond spoke of people continuing to whisper her name over incense smoke, of children whose lullabies honored the beautiful, tragic queen, of poems in Egyptian demonic recited in hidden shrines. Even in Rome, when Cleopatra Selene, her daughter, grew to adulthood and became queen of Mauritania through political marriage, she held fast to the memory of her mother, commissioning temples and participating in rites that recovered traces of Egypt in North Africa. Within Egypt itself, resistance simmered, sometimes rising in open revolt by priests and peasants who saw the Roman taxes as desecration. In later years, insurrection spread among the descendants of soldiers and scribes who had once exclaimed, "Ankh Jet" for Cleopatra. But the force of Rome was overwhelming, and each rebellion was crushed. Still, the sense of a lost golden age clung to the land, reimagined in folk tales and temple graffiti that defied imperial censors. Beyond myth, Cleopatra's innovations endured. The administrative structures she reinforced became the backbone of Roman Egypt. The census, begun under her, enabled Rome's famous grain shipments that fed the metropolis itself. The restoration projects she undertook, the irrigation systems and urban improvements, continued to benefit the land long after her death. The stories of her medical knowledge, her expertise in pharmacology and cosmetics, filtered into Roman and then Byzantine texts, garbled, at times romanticized, but always persistent. Likewise, the spirit of Alexandrian scholarship, bolstered by her patronage, survived in the laboratories and scriptoriums of the city. Her encouragement of mathematicians and astronomers, her protection of translators and poets, planted seeds that would grow even as Roman administrators struggled to curb the city's independence. The library, though diminished, became a symbol of lost brilliance, its shadow falling over all later accounts of human knowledge and its impermanence. Her personal life, so often twisted in the retelling, contained lessons only barely grasped before being swept into legend. Cleopatra, far from being a mere figure of romance, had been a mother obsessed with her children's future, a scholar constantly questioning, a policymaker calculating risk and reward with every gesture. Her correspondence, some fragments of which surfaced centuries later, hinted at a woman lonely in triumph and vulnerable in power, acutely aware that each victory was shadowed by threat. If Cleopatra's death marked the end of pharaonic Egypt, it also marked the emergence of something even larger, a mythology that would travel far beyond Alexandria's ruined palaces. Over generations, her story became the subject of Roman poetry, at first as warning, eventually as lament. Lucan, Virgil, and Propertius imbued her memory with both menace and majesty. Later, Byzantine chroniclers and Arab historians reinterpreted her as a philosopher, healer, or even proto-alchemist. By the time Shakespeare reimagined her in the English tongue, Cleopatra was no longer simply a queen. She was the idea of Egypt itself, mysterious, enchanting, and forever balancing the knife edge of power and loss. What lessons are to be drawn from such a life? Cleopatra's fate is a meditation on vision, ambition, and the costs exacted by both personal passion and public duty. She was unafraid to challenge tradition, to shape empires with diplomacy and force alike, but the world gave her little room for error. She moved in a world with little space for a powerful woman, much less one who could outthink, outlast, and for so long, outmaneuver the greatest empire of her time. So let the fourth message from Cleopatra's life settle like morning mist over the Nile, that the greatest achievements are often made more luminous by their endings, that to strive is to risk, and that compassion and intellect, though fragile before the armies of fate, endure in the imagination, the most fertile soil of all. As the centuries moved on, Cleopatra VII, last pharaoh, slipped from the realm of living memory into that of myth. In the decades following her death, the shock of her fall lingered in the air like the perfume that once trailed behind her through the halls of Alexandria. Yet the world, Roman, Greek, Egyptian, and far beyond, found it impossible to simply let her story rest. Instead, it was retold again and again, each time reshaped, embellished, or weaponized by those who conjured her memory for their own purposes. The woman Cleopatra became the legend Cleopatra, a process that reveals as much about the times that followed her as it does about her own remarkable reign. The Romans, victors with anxious minds, sought to dominate her legacy as thoroughly as they had her kingdom. Augustus's publicists and poets, quick to justify both war and conquest, depicted Cleopatra in increasingly extravagant terms. The Eastern seductress, the wanton destroyer of Roman virtue, a sorceress whose cunning threatened to upend the natural order. Virgil, Propertius, and especially Horace cast her as an accursed queen, an Egyptian fury, yes, but also a rival worthy of Roman dread, a backhanded compliment from an age uneasy with the very scale of what she had almost achieved. Yet despite the demonizations, there were always dissenting voices, those who marveled at the scale of her intellect and the boldness of her ambition. Plutarch, writing more than a century after her death, sifted through the Roman myths and returned her some of her humanity. He admitted her wit was as great a weapon as her beauty, and her voice a richer lure than any spell. Dio Cassius and Appian debated her political acumen, some grudgingly acknowledging the scope of her knowledge and her deep grasp of statecraft. Even enemies found in Cleopatra something compelling, a figure who transcended the conventions of both her own age and their judgments. Travelers, centuries later, claimed to see signs of her everywhere. In ruined palaces swallowed by Alexandria's waves, in hypostyle halls, whose walls bore erased cartouches, in the golden jewelry unearthed by Nile farmers, in lone statues still standing in time-worn necropolises. Her profile, stamped on silver coins, changed hands across continents, sometimes worn smooth by the commerce of centuries, yet always unmistakable for the resolute, noble brow and the severity of her gaze. Among the Greeks of Alexandria, her legend mixed with the mysteries of Isis and ancient tales of goddesses reborn. The Copts told stories of a queen who had bargained not merely with Rome, but with fate itself. In the folk memory of rural Egyptians, Cleopatra was never solely foreign or infidel. She became a kind of hidden saint, a woman of magic, wisdom, and tragedy, one who had tried, even if for an instant, to restore the golden age of math, order, and balance to the land. In the courts of Byzantium, Cleopatra's legend mutated yet again. Chroniclers and poets fused her with ancient tales, and with the Christian ethos taking root in the empire. She became a cautionary figure, a cipher for lust and temptation, but also, in moments, a symbol of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Arab scholars, inheriting much of Greco-Egyptian science, gave her new form. Medieval writers attributed treatises on alchemy, medicine, and the art of love to Cleopatra, sometimes conflating her with other learned women of Alexandria, but always associating her with lost knowledge, esoteric wisdom, and a mysterious, unquenchable spirit. Western Europe received Cleopatra's story through a veil of layers: classical Roman accounts, Byzantine retellings, and later, the ambiguous wonders described by medieval pilgrims and scholars. To many, she was at once the embodiment of female peril and the possible ideal of regal womanhood. Both the church and wandering minstrels kept her name alive with wildly divergent interpretations. One moment a symbol of sin, the next a paragon of devotion and loyalty, especially in her love for Antony. The Renaissance, with its passion for reviving antiquity, transformed Cleopatra yet again. In Italy and France, in paintings and poems, she became a figure of sensual grandeur and tragic nobility, her lovers equal, if not superior, in intelligence, rhetoric, and poise. The famous painters Guercino, Tiepolo, Jerome sought to capture in pigment the moment of her death, her beauty undimmed, poised with an asp in hand, and her dignity unsullied before the coming shadow. Shakespeare, with his pen, rendered her paradox incarnate. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. In the theaters of London, Paris, and Rome, Cleopatra became the very image of womanly resilience, wit, and soul-shaking emotion. The seeds of her legend scattered even further in the modern era. Historians and archaeologists probed Alexandria's sands, trying to recover the real woman lost amid the sooty smoke of Roman propaganda. Fragments emerged, old papyri describing her decrees, coins and jewelry attesting to her unique style, steles noting her priestly acts, records of embassies and debts and gifts. Scholars debated her appearance, her sexuality, her ethnicity, her true accomplishments, and in every argument, the myth enlarged rather than shrank. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Cleopatra came to embody new forms of rebellion. Feminist writers questioned why her intellect was always overshadowed by mythic seduction. Novelists, playwrights, and filmmakers reimagined her story for every age, from Theda Bara in silent films to Elizabeth Taylor with her cat's eye makeup and stylized knock on the gates of Rome, to theater directors and poets seeking Cleopatra in every woman who refused to bow before the dictates of convention. But beneath all the interpretations, the secret legacies of her reign remained. Innovations in finance and urban governance, the patronage of libraries and temples, achievements in medicine and scholarship, the example of a woman wielding supreme power in a world that almost never allowed such things to stand. And then there is the human story, the Cleopatra too often lost amid myth, the girl who watched her father exiled and fought for a throne, the woman who preserved Egypt's sovereignty for an entire generation while the world shifted around her, the leader who risked everything to defend her children, and the scholar who lived by candlelight among scrolls and thinkers in the most storied city of her age. The truth behind the legend matters because it gives shape and meaning to the myth. Cleopatra's persistence in the world's imagination is no accident or fluke. It is the consequence of a life lived in the crucible of history. Her failures are as important as her triumphs. Her loves as telling as her strategies of statecraft. Her death a reflection not simply of defeat, but of a final, sovereign act of self-determination. She shows us the cost of ambition and the danger of greatness, the price paid by those who dare to challenge the patterns expected of them. Let this, then, be the fifth message from Cleopatra's life, that while time may grind monuments to dust, it cannot erase the effect of one willful spirit daring to stand upon the world's stage, embodying its glories and contradictions with eyes wide open, knowing both the price and the promise that such a role commands. In the swirling tides of history that followed Cleopatra's death, her name became a vessel for meaning far beyond the world she had known. Across the centuries, empires rose and fell, ideologies shifted, and cultures blended, and yet Cleopatra's essence endured, ever mutable, ever compelling. Whether as a symbol of feminine power, political savvy, tragic romance, or exotic other, she left an imprint on world civilization that rivals that of few mortal rulers. During the late antiquity and medieval period, Cleopatra's story was retold with new layers of mythology. Early Christian writers grappled uneasily with her image, a queen who had embraced paganism, Egyptian divinity, and Roman seduction, and often cast her as a worldly enchantress who embodied the dangers of lust and ambition. Nonetheless, fragments of admiration appeared amid the condemnations. Her intellect, her multilingual prowess, and her role as a monarch who sought to unify diverse peoples were occasionally praised. The alchemical and medical lore attributed to her by Arabic scholars, although often blended with legends, contributed to perceptions of Cleopatra as a wise woman, a scholar whose curiosity spanned the physical and mystical realms. As medieval Europe slowly reconnected with classical knowledge through the Renaissance, Cleopatra was rediscovered in a new light. Humanists unearthed the writings of Plutarch and others, providing more textured portraits that revealed a woman of striking intelligence and relentless political will. Artists embraced the challenge of capturing her figure and spirit, using their brushes and pens to interpret her story across dimensions of beauty, power, and tragedy. The Renaissance fascination with human potential was naturally drawn to Cleopatra, an emblem of multifaceted complexity, pushing against boundaries in art and politics alike. Her story became a dramatic motif in literature and theater. Plays by Shakespeare and other dramatists portrayed Cleopatra not just as a queen and lover, but as a woman commanding her fate with a riotous energy and profound vulnerability. The image of Cleopatra transformed again and again, from a sorceress to a sovereign, a victim to a victor, a symbol of empire to a timeless persona embodying the eternal conflict between duty and desire. Beside the stage and canvas, scholarly inquiry endured. Archaeologists excavated Alexandria and other Ptolemaic sites, slowly piecing together Cleopatra's material world. Coins bearing her likeness, remnants of temples and palaces, and inscriptions in Greek and Egyptian offered glimpses into the reign of a ruler who masterfully navigated two contrasting cultures. The discovery of her release of grain stores to stave off famine, her sponsorship of scholars and medical practitioners, and her commissioning of architectural works displayed the breadth of her governance and her determination to secure Egypt's prosperity. In the modern era, Cleopatra transcended history to become a cultural icon. Literature, film, and media cast her in a kaleidoscope of roles, from a femme fatale to a proto-feminist, from a political strategist to a symbol of cultural synthesis. The iconic portrayal by Elizabeth Taylor cemented Cleopatra's image in popular imagination as a seductive and brilliant queen who could bend the course of empires. Simultaneously, academic reassessments highlighted her intellectual abilities, linguistic mastery, and her efforts to maintain Egypt's autonomy in the face of an expanding Roman power. Her role as a woman who ruled in a male-dominated world continues to captivate. Cleopatra's life becomes a case study of leadership under extreme pressure, a leader balancing public charisma with private strategy, devotion with pragmatism, innovation with tradition. She reminds us that gender biases and cultural misconceptions often obscure the true nature of leadership. Her story challenges us to look beyond stereotype and myth, to understand power and influence in all their complexities. Over 2 millennia later, Cleopatra still calls forth questions about identity, sovereignty, and legacy. Questions about how marginalized figures reshape history, about the intersection of culture and power, and about how myth can both illuminate and distort reality. In global discussions on female leadership, colonial history, and ancient cultural exchanges, Cleopatra remains a luminous figure, at once a subject of scholarship and a symbol of resilience. This ongoing fascination offers lessons both practical and philosophical. It teaches that a leader's greatest power lies not only in conquest or wealth, but in the ability to adapt, inspire, and express vision through multiple means: diplomacy, culture, intellect, and symbolic presence. Cleopatra's stewardship of Egypt as a vibrant, culturally rich, and diplomatically savvy state speaks to the strength that lies in blending tradition with innovation. She also exemplifies the costs of power, the personal losses, betrayals, and ultimate loneliness that often shadow those who dare to challenge the great tides of history. Her final act of choosing death on her own terms echoes across time as a testament to autonomy and perhaps defiance. The legend and the history interweave here. The mortal woman who refused to be paraded as a captive, the queen who envisioned an empire and saw it crushed, yet whose story endures in the hopes and fears of millions. The message emerging from Cleopatra's life resonates strongly for modern audiences. Greatness requires unyielding courage and imagination, tempered by a deep understanding of the complexities of power and allegiance. It is a reminder that history is not written only by victors, but is shaped by those who refuse invisibility, who insist on telling their stories in all their contradiction and color. Let this then be the sixth message drawn from Cleopatra's enduring life, that the struggle to shape fate, to wield power with wisdom and tenacity, remains a central story of humanity's journey. And Cleopatra's life is a vivid chapter in that ongoing tale. The life and legend of Cleopatra continue to ripple far beyond the boundaries of her own era, traveling through centuries of culture, politics, and art, casting shadows and sparks in equal measure. The final chapters of her story, like the rest, are intertwined with memory, myth, and meaning, forever inviting each generation to question who Cleopatra truly was and what she represents. In the centuries following the establishment of Augustus's principate, Cleopatra's image began to crystallize into archetypes, powerful motifs in the collective imagination. Early Roman writers, many hostile to her memory, crafted an enduring caricature. The dangerous foreign queen, the seductress whose wiles threatened to corrupt Roman values and weaken their empire. This archetype fed anxieties about gender, empire, and otherness, resonating in cultural narratives long after the empire itself fragmented. Cleopatra, in these depictions, became a symbol of temptation and downfall, the femme fatale to Roman virtue's hero. Yet this simplistic figure was challenged by voices willing to peer beneath the surface. The greatest ancient historians, Plutarch, Appian, Dio Cassius, revealed glimpses of a more complex woman. A ruler versed in multiple languages, a tactician capable of commanding armies, a figure of intellect and learning who actively engaged with scholars and priests. These accounts, when read with care, portray a sovereign who was as much a product of her time as she was an innovator ahead of it. Cleopatra's mastery of political symbolism and personal diplomacy rivaled any statesman, male or female, in history. Her understanding of culture was not superficial exoticism, but a profound recognition that power could be built on the foundations of identity and belief. Medieval and Renaissance Europeans, rediscovering Greek and Roman texts, found in Cleopatra a reflective mirror of their own struggles with authority, gender, and empire. She inspired poets like Petrarch and Machiavelli, painters like Titian and Rubens, and later dramatists who saw in her the embodiment of a sorrowful yet majestic queen caught in the crossroads of fate. This fueled her transformation into a literary and artistic muse, her story adapting to fit the concerns and aesthetics of each age. In the arts, Cleopatra's image fluctuated between erudite sovereign and exotic enchantress, a duality subject to interpretation and projection. In Shakespeare's tragedy, she is a figure of infinite variety, simultaneously commanding and vulnerable, driven by love and ambition, a living question about the nature of power and passion. The play's enduring popularity ensured that Cleopatra remained not just a historical figure, but a living spirit of cultural inquiry. The Enlightenment and subsequent centuries brought new approaches. Enlightenment thinkers debated Cleopatra's role in the decline of Republican Rome and the rise of empire, sometimes critiquing her as a threat to liberty, and at other times admiring her strategic acumen. Archaeology and historical scholarship advanced in the 19th and 20th centuries, striving to reconstruct her reign from material evidence, papyri, and inscriptions, often challenging the biased ancient sources. Here we find Cleopatra, the patron of science and the arts, the multilingual queen who embraced Egyptian traditions while maintaining Greek heritage, the innovator who sought to stabilize her kingdom in a world dominated by Rome's growing power. At the same time, modern feminist interpretations have reclaimed Cleopatra as a symbol of female agency and resilience. Amid centuries of patriarchal depiction, contemporary studies emphasize her intellect, leadership, and political savvy, not simply as a figure defined by her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, but as a sovereign who navigated extraordinary challenges with unprecedented skill. Her life illustrates the complexities of power for women rulers, highlighting themes of negotiation, adaptation, and survival in environments hostile to female sovereignty. Cleopatra's story also serves as a touchstone in post-colonial and cultural studies. Her position as a Hellenistic queen, ruling over an Egyptian majority, balancing Greek and native customs, negotiating the pressures of an expanding imperial romanscape, symbolizes broader dialogues about identity, hybridity, and power. She embodies the tensions and possibilities of cross-cultural rule, of forging unity amid diversity, lessons resonant in global history. Her legacy extends into the realm of symbolic geography as well. Alexandria, the city she ruled and cherished, remains one of the world's great cultural crossroads. Its layered history, a testament to the mingling of Mediterranean, African, and Near Eastern civilizations. The traces of Cleopatra's reign linger in the archaeological record, a city shaped by her vision, innovation, and patronage, a monument to the vibrancy and ambition of her age. Looking deeper, Cleopatra's narrative challenges us to rethink historiography, the ways in which history is constructed, who tells it, and the power dynamics shaping those stories. The dichotomy between Cleopatra the myth and Cleopatra, the woman, reminds us that history is not a fixed record, but a site of ongoing interpretation, enriched by new perspectives, methodologies, and voices. Her life story becomes a case study in the intersection of gender, politics, propaganda, and cultural memory. One contemporary lesson from Cleopatra's life lies in the art of leadership itself. She embodied adaptability, the capacity to pivot amid rapidly shifting political landscapes. Her command of language, symbolism, and alliance building underscores the multifaceted nature of power beyond mere force. She teaches that leadership requires navigating multiple identities simultaneously, balancing authenticity with performance, tradition with innovation. Cleopatra's courage in standing against overwhelming odds, her resilience in exile and return, her willingness to embrace both diplomatic subtlety and bold action, highlight the qualities necessary in arenas of change and uncertainty. Her story suggests that the line between triumph and tragedy is often narrow, defined as much by perception and narrative as by concrete events. Moreover, her tragic end offers a meditation on autonomy and dignity in defeat. Choosing death on her own terms, refusing the spectacle of subjugation, she reclaimed control over the final act of her life. That final choice resonates with universal themes of self-possession and defiance, echoing through literature, philosophy, and art. Cabinet to her enduring legend is the message that history is shaped not only by victors, but also by those who resist, who dream, who dare to embody difference. Cleopatra's life invites us to embrace complexity, to question simplistic qualities, and to honor the multifaceted legacies that define humanity. Let this seventh message from Cleopatra's story be one of reflection, that power is as much about narrative and perception as it is about armies and treaties, that history is a dialogue across ages, and that the greatest figures are those who, through intellect, will, and imagination, continue to inspire questions rather than just answers. Cleopatra's final legacy is both concrete and ethereal, a weaving of fact and myth, memory and imagination. Even 2,000 years after the last Pharaoh of Egypt passed from the world, her image endures in art, literature, scholarship, and popular culture, unfixed by time and endlessly rediscovered. She inhabits the liminal space between history and legend, between sovereign and siren, between a woman who lived in palpable political reality and one who has become a symbol for power, passion, intellect, and resilience. The enduring fascination with Cleopatra stems partly from the compelling contradictions her life embodies. She was a scholar and a sensualist, a warrior and a diplomat, a mother and a monarch, a Greek ruling Egypt, yet embracing deeply its traditions, a player on the stage of Rome's great men while fiercely guarding her nation's independence. These contrasts make her an endlessly rich subject for study and storytelling. Her life defies simple categorization or easy dismissal. Her death remains shrouded in mystery and speculation, not merely because ancient sources differ, but because the motivations behind it raise profound questions about agency and honor. Did she use an asp's venom, a toxic ointment, or a fatal combination of poisons? Was her death the act of a defeated ruler or a defiant queen claiming control over her narrative? In any case, Cleopatra's final choice speaks to a theme that echoes powerfully: the reclaiming of one's destiny in the face of inevitable loss, the assertion of dignity amid the collapse of empires. Beyond the drama of her end, Cleopatra's legacy is inseparable from the cultural and political crossroads that she embodied. Alexandria, her city, remains a metaphor for encounter and exchange, while Egypt itself stands as the crucible where East meets West, antiquity meets innovation. Cleopatra's reign marked one of the last moments when Egypt could assert itself as a sovereign player before falling fully under imperial Roman dominion, and her attempts at maintaining autonomy and cultural pride resonate with struggles for identity that continue worldwide. The lessons Cleopatra offers transcend her own time. Her life illustrates that leadership is an art of constant negotiation between tradition and change, personal ambition and public duty, local cultures and global forces. That intellect and charisma, when paired with strategic foresight and determination, can carve out space for greatness, even in turbulent, hostile contexts. And that the interplay between myth and history complicates but also enriches our understanding of human potential. Today, Cleopatra inspires not only historians, but also artists, feminists, political thinkers, and those who seek role models of complex leadership and resilience. She reminds us that history is rarely the story of neat victories or simple villains, but of contested meanings, layered identities, and enduring human dramas. Her life, wrought with challenge and brilliance, courage and tragedy, invites continuous reinterpretation and encourages us to reflect on how we remember and retell the past. As you reflect on Cleopatra's epic journey, from a young woman thrust into dynastic battles to a sovereign who dared to rule with intellect, heart, and audacity, consider the power of resilience, the necessity of vision, and the cost such a path entails. Cleopatra's story isn't simply the tale of a queen. It is an invitation to explore the human capacity to adapt, to fight, and ultimately to shape history on one's own terms. Thank you for journeying through the life and legacy of Cleopatra VII, a woman who remains a luminous figure in the annals of history and imagination. May her story inspire you to seek knowledge, embrace complexity, and lead with courage, no matter the challenges ahead.